Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers, here's the Labour Party spokesperson for Auckland issues, friend to the worker and downtrodden. Here's a fighter and a lover, Te Atatu MP Phil Twyford, and here's the political columnist for the NBR, political consultant, commentator and moral shepherd of the right, Matthew Hooton. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue one. Despite the grubby casino deal, despite asset sales and despite the Crayford farm sale, National are more popular than ever. Is it because David Shearer isn't connecting or is it because Key is Teflon? Issue two. Super Ministry Czar Stephen Joyce wants to axe 130 public sector jobs to create his own personal fiefdom. Should Bill English be concerned? Issue 3. Next month is the last month of TVNZ 7. Why is public broadcasting so hated by National? And we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off with issue 1. Despite a raft of policies that are about as welcome as the bubonic plague, the landline polls, with their flawed methodology, keep claiming Key is more popular than a Viagra pill at an orgy. What is happening? Matthew, let's be clear. The casino deal is grubby, isn't it? What is a free market party doing propping up a gambling industry, and why isn't that distaste being reflected in the polls?
Yeah, well, I know where I come from politically. I'm from the Reagan, Thatcher, Ruth Richardson, Roger Douglas school of politics, and that says you create level playing fields and you create regulatory environments so markets work better in particular industries. What you don't do is deal with particular businesses and change the law when issues emerge. You try and think ahead and regulate markets. So this is very strange. It's similar to the Warner Brothers. Instead of saying we are a national party, we are centre-right, we believe that the labour laws in New Zealand should be regulated in this way, they don't do anything for 2 and a bit years that's consistent with National Party philosophy. They wait till there is a problem and then they fix it. Now, this is not the right way of governing, and while the Prime Minister and the National Party on this have picked up support from the Sunday Star Times, which I'm sure they'll be delighted about, you know, most important newspapers have editorialised against them. It is a bad deal, and the Prime Minister shouldn't have got himself involved in it this way.
There is an old saying, Labour's good for the economy, National's good for the monopolies. Is that what we're seeing here?
Well, what they should have done is, if there were going to be 500 pokies on the table, the proper way to have gone about this is to have declared that through the tender process, instead of just telling one of the 5 tenderers, perhaps you can get 500 pokies. They should have gone to Infratel and Ngāti Whātua and said, look, if you build us a $350 million convention centre, say on the waterfront where it really should be rather than a disused car park, but if you will build us a $350 million convention centre, we'll let you set up a casino with 500 pokie machines. That, you know, that would have been the rule, and the 5 tenderers could have said, okay, and Ngāti Whātua or Infratel could have said, okay, if we get a casino licence, would it be worth it? And there would have been a fair tender process. It was wrong that of the 5 tenderers, it seems, and that we're still waiting to see if the Auditor General will investigate this. The Green Party has requested that, but it looked on the face of it that only one of the 5 tenderers knew about the possibility of this deal.
Does that then reek of mates doing mates' job? You know, sort of.
I think that's going too far, but I think what it shows is that when ideas come up, the Prime Minister and the government start negotiating, as you would as a business. I mean, business is about seeing unusual connections. Entrepreneurship is seeing unusual connections that other people haven't seen, making those connections happen to create value. Well, that's not actually how governments are meant to work.
Political leadership requires more than that.
They're meant to declare those connections in advance.
Phil, Crayford Farm sold off to the Chinese to pacify our overseas masters, asset sales that will increase power charges for us all, and a casino deal so grubby that even Matthew Hooton is writing ill of it. Labour has never had so much sunshine to harvest. Hey, yet Labour flounder in the polls. Is the Shearer experiment failing?
Well, I think on the casino thing, I don't come from the Reagan Thatcher side of politics. I come from the other side. But I find the sort of crony capitalism that Matthew describes, I find that equally distasteful. It's a sort of shonky, grubby kind of impulse to do deals, really, with no regard for proper process, for transparency and fairness. So, and I think people are repelled by that. But I also think what's missing from this discussion is what's good for Auckland, because the starting point for the deal was, do we need a convention centre? And I thought Brian Rudman had some interesting things to say in the Herald this week about raising the idea of, say, sticking a convention centre, which is, after all, a big box that doesn't look outward on the city, sticking it on top of the Aotea Centre, which coincidentally needs a new roof at the moment, in a precinct which is surrounded by hotels and that big civic space. It's in the middle of town there. Why haven't we been having that discussion?
That's right.
Why haven't we publicly been considering the business case for the assumption is there is a business case for it. Let's see it, actually. And I agree with Matthew. Let's have the parties actually put their cards on the table. And, how are we going to fund it if we're not going to fund it out of the pockets of problem gamblers and some of the poorest communities in Auckland? How are we going to fund it?
Well, but there's not a business case. I mean, it seems to be it's build it and they will come, and that's a very bad way that did lead to the Aotea Centre, which I don't believe has delivered the economic benefits that were promised at the time. That also is in the wrong place. I'm surprised, Phil, that as Auckland spokesperson, the idea that Auckland should be detached from its harbour and we should have all our main assets up the top of Queen Street or midway through Queen Street and not down where that vulgar port is that should be closed. I mean,
you want sold off?
Well, for goodness sake, I mean, most sensible cities have their harbour. Then they have things like their opera houses, their convention centres, their tourist areas. Then they have office space. Then they have housing. In Auckland, everything's completely round the wrong way, and that's the debate that someone needs to lead. Because
the convention centre is the last thing in the world you want to put on the waterfront. It's an inward-looking big box. From an urban design perspective, the waterfront, it would be a waste of prime real estate.
Depending on how it's designed.
Well, you can't design a convention centre that becomes an iconic building on the waterfront.
The current design has all the architectural charm of a road accident, doesn't it? Come on, you've looked at it.
Well, it's consistent with the way the deal was put together. It does sort of feel a little bit Eastern European, circa 1970s, which is similar to the way the deal seems to be.
But that's pretty much the nature of convention centres, though. And anyway, the other issue is, if we think it's a good idea, how are we going to pay for it, right? If it is a good idea, well, then central government and Auckland Council should be weighing it up as a priority and putting their hands in their pockets. On the other hand, Infratil say they've got a great deal. They did something in Melbourne. Maybe a PPP is possible. But actually, you know what? We don't know. We don't know what the numbers are. We don't know what's possible because John Key short-circuited the normal process, cut Infratil off at the knees, and did this backroom deal with Sky City. So that's
okay. So with all of this grubbiness and with all of these issues, why is Labour not getting it? Why are we not seeing them increase in the polls? What's going on?
Well, it's a $64,000 question, but my response, Bomber, to that is that it's very early days. We're only a few months out from an election. The country just voted, right? They made some choices. There's another 2.5 years before people vote again. People don't necessarily rush into choosing which way they're going to vote next time. So I think the challenge for Labour is that we've just got to get down in the trenches, do the hard work, be the best opposition we can, raise the issues, speak up for people, start to develop a clear alternative to put before the electorate, and have some faith.
Matthew, at the infamous I Predict election after party that I and you were at, you were instrumental in pushing Shearer over Cunliffe. Was your punt wrong for Labour, and when does the challenge for Grant Robertson gain legs?
Oh, I don't think that's right at all. I mean, both David Cunliffe and David Shearer were invited to my party, and only David Shearer showed up. And at that party, there was all the political commentators and key political journalists in New Zealand.
Don't turn down an invite from Matthew Hooton. That's the lesson.
And as a result, David Shearer put his case, and within a week, all the major political commentators had endorsed him. And perhaps David Cunliffe, perhaps he was babysitting and was unable to attend the party. But look, Shearer, I think, has been poorly advised by the caucus. I think some of the caucus on the left of the Labour caucus are uncomfortable with where he wanted potentially to take the party. For example, he's very attracted, I understand, to things like the wealth funds, the sovereign wealth funds that they have in Singapore, which is the source of Singapore's economic prosperity. That was set up by Lee Kuan Yew.
Oh, and their authoritarian grip on
power
we've
got things. I mean, we have the start of them. The ACC is a very successful fund. The Cullen Fund, it's very successful. We've got this SOE portfolio. I mean, you could put all those assets together into a dynamic fund like they have in Singapore, but I suppose some on the left would think, oh no, that could mean there could be some privatisation one day in the future. So that's been stopped. There was talk around the Shearer circle of looking very carefully about whether whānau really are the best people to look after children at risk, because in fact children at risk are most at risk from their whānau. That is just a statistical fact, and most public policy in New Zealand, social policy, seems to be whānau first. David Shearer and his supporters wanted to challenge that. The left of the Labour Party, it looks to me, have stopped that from happening. And on it goes, things like the emissions trading scheme. The Shearer faction was interested in looking at more innovative ways of dealing with climate change that reflect the fact the Kyoto system has broken. The left of Labour has stopped that. And so it's a tragedy, really. And now, of course, the far left of Labour is imposing their own people
Alistair Cameron taking
on the office.
From
and he's a very, very close friend of Grant Robinson.
Yes.
So I think poor old David Shearer, I mean, he hasn't been allowed to thrive and lead the way I think he wanted to by the left of Labour. And now I think the deal is, look, either follow a left-wing, boring Helen Clark type agenda that looks backwards, or we'll take the leadership off.
Is it Cunliffe versus Shearer?
Well,
is it Cunliffe versus Robertson?
Well, I think Cunliffe probably learned his lesson in the leadership, that he's not liked by the left because they think he's right, and he's not liked by the right because they think he's left,
crazy.
which is never a good
Phil,
position.
the landline methodology of these polls is deeply flawed, and the impact of the mainstream media telling New Zealanders that John Key had over 50% support for 3 years saw the lowest voter turnout in 120 years. Are we buying into propaganda that Key is popular because the asset sale submission suggests outright loathing of the man?
I'm reluctant to blame the polls. I mean, I know the landline bias theory is very plausible, but actually when you look at the poll of polls over the last couple of cycles, generally the polls get it, close to right, don't they? I mean, so I'm not looking there for an explanation. I think there's something more complicated going on with the nation's feelings about John Key as a leader, and the nation voted to put John Key and National back into office, but I think there's a process going on now where people are re-evaluating, and they saw in the latter stages of the election campaign, they've certainly seen it in the last few months, aside to John Key's leadership, that has no kind of value base. There's no direction or vision for,
it's just
for
cost
the
analysis,
future.
isn't it?
That's right,
Yeah.
for the future of the country.
This is not what the polls are saying at all. I mean, I think that's a rather desperate line by Labour, just hoping one day that he's going to be unpopular. What the polls actually are saying is since the election, he's picked up 73, nearly 75,000 more supporters. It's not a question.
Do you believe that?
Well, you're the one that you're the one that supports the polls and thinks they're accurate. I think they're completely wrong. There wasn't a poll last year that didn't have National over 50%. The only accurate source of political information was iPredict.
Quick question to both of you. What does John Key have to do to lose support? Because you get the feeling he could shoot a baby in the face on close-up, and a large chunk of the viewing audience would blame the baby. What does he need to do to actually lose support?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on the dynamics between the government and the opposition, and I think that when people sense that the opposition is a government in waiting, that starts to affect how they feel about the government, and people start to weigh up that choice. And that's the challenge for us. The challenge for us is to basically present ourselves as a credible government in waiting, and then I think people will look at John Key in a different light.
What does John Key have to do to lose support?
Well, it doesn't look like
there is
anything. I mean, he will get less popular as time goes on. That is an inevitable process. People like the new and reject the old, and eventually he will have been there for longer. But, I think Labour should be, if they really want to make a proper crack of the next election, I don't think just wanting to look like a government in waiting is the way to go. I think they need to lead on issues. And the classic example of that would be when Don Brash became leader of the National Party. Bill English had spent a lot of time...
marijuana.
Well, no. When he became leader of the National Party. Bill English had spent ages wanting to look like a credible Prime Minister and waiting and develop and all this sort of thing. What Don Brash did is, and it was his personal view, he gave that speech at Orewa.
The gotcha moment where Shearer doesn't believe it.
Well, no, but I'm not talking about the quality of the issue.
Yeah.
But that was what he believed in. He led his party. Most of the National Party at that time was actually very proud of the treaty settlement process led by Doug Graham.
Right.
National had actually been a very liberal government on social issues and Maori issues in the 1990s. But Don Brash gave that speech, led the party, and the rest of the National Party went, well, okay, if that's where the leader's going, we'll follow him. Now, that is what Shearer has to do.
Thank you, panel. Moving on to issue 2. Super Ministry czar Stephen Joyce wants to axe 130 public sector jobs to create his own personal fiefdom. Should Bill English be concerned? Matthew, a lot of focus last month on the National Party factional war between Bogue and Collins that accidentally destroyed Nick Smith with friendly fire. But in terms of factional war, should the focus be on English and Joyce?
Oh, I don't have much good to say about what the government's done over the last quarter. I mean, what you've got with this super bureaucracy is an extraordinary thing. I mean, that speech John Key gave, firstly, it did two things. It said that he was going to set these Soviet-style targets for the public sector. You know, we will produce more steel. There will be more level 2 people coming out of schools.
More coal production.
And then we're waiting for them to be confirmed. And then there's going to be 5-year plans written for each of the 10 targets. I mean, this is something, again, out of Eastern Europe, 1970s. And then he wants to set up a super bureaucracy to make these things happen. That super bureaucracy is going to have 3,000 bureaucrats in its head office. That's 3 times the size of Fonterra's head office.
Yeah.
And the idea that merging super bureaucracies are going to deliver anything, again, is not particular. I know where my politics is. I question whether the people that wrote that speech for John Key know where theirs is.
Phil, why on earth does the Department of Labour, Department of Building and Housing and the Ministry of Science and Innovation have to be merged to become more business friendly? What does more business friendly mean?
Well, I think that the jargon they've been using in the speech and since then is business facing.
Business facing. What does business facing mean?
I don't know. I mean, it's bizarre. This government started out campaigning on the idea that they were going to close the gap with Australia. They were going to stop the exodus to Australia. They were going to take us to some new economic nirvana.
Failed. Epic
And
fail.
we are reduced to basically reorganising government departments and selling stuff.
Yeah.
And that's all they've got.
Or casinos.
Yeah,
Casinos selling stuff or reorganising
Yeah,
ministries.
so we're at a pretty low ebb in,
Yep.
in this department, and I don't think anyone believes that merging these departments into a super ministry is going to make the boat go faster, as they like to say.
Matthew,
Well, what's Labor doing about it? This is incredible. I mean, here you've got, again, a government failing to provide a coherent economic reform program. In my view, going down a failed approach.
They're touring the provinces.
I mean, for goodness sake, do you support the new super ministry or not?
We've criticised it probably every day for the last 2 weeks. We've criticised it on economic grounds. We've said it's a waste of time, that when you do these massive restructurings, it takes years for institutions to recover, so that you lose momentum, you lose skilled people, you end up paying out millions of dollars in private consultants to pick up the load for all the people who've been sacked.
Matthew,
we haven't been silent.
Except I
they've been
guess
very
you've got
loud.
a problem that you generally support the public sector.
There could, well, who doesn't? There could be some argument, Matt, for linking the back office services of these departments, but merging policy focus for departments as diverse as labour, housing, science and the economy makes about as much sense as merging the Women Affairs, public transport and the military, doesn't it? What's the real agenda?
I mean, I support, because I know what my politics are, the public sector reforms of firstly Roger Douglas and then Ruth Richardson, which said that ministers should have contestable advice from different government departments. So that's why they were split, many government departments were split into smaller entities that would give conflicting, in some cases, policy advice to ministers for ministers to consider.
Sure.
Ministers would also consider advice from NGOs and the private sector. Now, what Stephen Joyce has said is he doesn't want that anymore. He just wants one set of policy advice from one department. He doesn't want to get different advice from the Department of Labour or the Department of Housing or the Ministry for Economic Development.
Does that mean the quality of advice is lowered?
Well, what it means is that it gives enormous power to mandarins,
Right.
to the most senior bureaucrats who are the ones who they will have policy analysts who are well educated and young, currently in the bureaucracy, who have different ideas, and instead of those ideas getting to ministers, getting to the cabinet room, and ministers themselves, the government leading, and the government saying, well, actually, we go with this advice from this particular ministry rather than from that ministry, there's just going to be one bit of paper coming.
Phil, with so much slash and burn on the public service, how many efficiencies are actually left to be made here? Come on.
Well, I don't think that this mega merger is about efficiencies mostly, and I think just to follow on from what Matthew said about Stephen Joyce's approach here, it actually is. it mirrors the kind of thing that he's done in transport, where he had a preconceived view about what should happen with our transport budget. He's created the ultimate Muldoonist wet dream with the roads of national significance, spending $1 billion a year of our money for the next decade on these gold-plated mega motorway projects that have no sensible economic rationale. There's no contestability of advice there. He sucked transport resources from everywhere else in the budget, and he's created this massive white elephant. And I think that he knows what's right. He's prepared to pick winners, and he's prepared to put massive state resources.
Wonderful bits to be infallible, isn't it? Quick final question here: should Bill English be concerned with the sudden concentration of power in Joyce's hands?
It's not sudden. Stephen Joyce has been the number 2 in the government since the very beginning.
But with these ministries merged, he certainly becomes a
Well,
czar.
I actually think I think Stephen Joyce is now totally overloaded. He's also, remember, the National Party's strategist and the Prime Minister's chief advisor. He receives the polling every single day.
Yes.
He chairs a committee to decide whether ministers are allowed to give interviews or not. He is going to be the National Party's campaign chairman in 2014, and I think he has reached the point, and he's running the tertiary education system. And I think that's why on the casino deal he gave some shocking media interviews, unable to answer basic questions about it because he's overloaded. And a funny way that gives an opportunity for Bill English to lead, because he's not so overloaded. And I mean, it's very strange. In the 1990s, when I was in the Richardson faction, Bill English was the hopeless wet. In this particular government, with its sort of leftward tilt, he's the free marketeer with the reform ideas.
Don't call it left
it's
wing.
incredible.
Exactly.
Corporatist, Stalinist.
Should Bill English be concerned?
Well, Joyce is an enormously powerful character, and I do think he's a Muldoonist. He's got all these impulses for creating empires, spending huge amounts of money, but he doesn't have any clear plan forward in terms of an economic vision and a plan for New Zealand. And that's the really worrying thing.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight. Next month is the last month of TVNZ7 as the government look to whore it off to a shopping channel, no less. Matthew, how does a reality show about Māoris living in Australia and New Zealand's Got Talent equate to public broadcasting? Doesn't National just want to strangle off media that hold them accountable in favour of pap entertainment for the masses?
Well, I'm not sure this is the case any longer, but if you think of Radio New Zealand in the 1970s and TVNZ as it was in the 1970s, it was far left, Labour Party infiltrated,
glorious
and
the
controlled,
years.
and it was
Matthew, what a load of horseshit.
If you think of the fact that Brian Edwards,
Great man,
right,
wonderful man.
who now considers the Labour Party under David Shearer too right wing for him.
Yes, right.
Right.
Going to the
I mean,
Greens
he's
now.
Helen
Going to the
Clark's
Greens.
best friend. He was this country's premier current affairs interviewer on state television in the 1970s.
In the
Similarly,
80s, you had Lindsay Perigo.
well, he was a news
Another
reader.
well-known
Yeah.
left
But
winger.
That's
here's the
right.
thing: National has always believed that these institutions
Are left-wing.
are left wing,
Right.
and that's what drives these decisions. And I think they're probably right to some extent, and that's why they feel this way about some of these things. The other thing, a more substantial thing is public broadcasting should not be about noble BBC-style documentaries. On Maori lesbians in pre-European times. I mean, which is sort of the state broadcasting model that are very, very worthy. I mean, a documentary about or a reality program about Maori living in Australia, when the shift to Australia is one of the major issues facing New Zealand. I think that
Based
probably
on the Jersey Shore, you know
I
that?
think it doesn't. It will engage people on the issues of the
Being
diaspora,
drunk. Yes.
perhaps more than noble BBC-style
Phil,
documentaries.
did Labour plant the seeds for their own demise by doing so very, very, very little in terms of extra funding for public broadcasting during their 3 terms in office? Would a 2014 Labour government take public broadcasting much more seriously?
Yeah, I don't know about the historical stuff, Bomber, because I wasn't around, then, but I would say that Labor now is much more committed to building a 21st century public broadcasting system.
Yep.
National hate public broadcasting. When was the
Loathe
last
it.
time you heard John Key on Morning Report
That's right.
doing a serious current affairs interview? In
Yeah.
fact, you hardly ever get a national minister appearing on,
That's right,
on
that's
national
right.
radio to front up on an issue.
They
It's-
do
it's-
radio sport now, don't they?
They prefer to do with the
Yes.
sports jocks. They prefer to
The
do
edge,
the
edge.
celebrity
Yeah,
stuff. That's
yeah.
right. The essence of good public broadcasting is about informed public debate. And if you look at broadcast journalism in New Zealand, it's only the public sector media outlets who do genuinely promote an informed public debate. National don't like that because they're much more comfortable with a commercialised media that is, for instance, tolerant of someone like Mike Hoskins getting thousands of dollars a year from Sky City and actually doing soft so-called media news interviews on his program without having declared that conflict of interest.
that's
So
pretty grubby.
there's a very different culture. If we're serious about our democracy in New Zealand, then we have to find a way to reinvent public broadcasting in the digital era.
Amen.
And some
Great
of
to
those
hear.
big institutions like TVNZ probably have passed their use by
Oh,
date.
Lord, haven't they just?
If we actually think on TV, who was the public broadcaster, even from a left-wing perspective, it's TV3. It was TV3 that broadcast that far-left documentary prior to the election on so-called
great
poverty or
truthful
whatever.
investigation.
I mean, incredible. Now,
It was a very good
that's
show, by the
that's
way.
a
Yeah, very
foreign-owned
good show.
company.
That's right,
And
that's
it
right.
does show there's no particular link between ownership of media outlets and content.
TVNZ up for sale?
TVNZ it either will be sold by one government one of these days, or it'll just slowly fade away and be worth nothing.
Let's wrap the show. We're going to wrap the show. Phil, your final word this week is?
Yeah, asset sales is the big issue of the day, I think. And this Saturday afternoon in Auckland there's going to be a march called the Aotearoa is Not for Sale demonstration. There's a broad coalition of political parties, unions, community organisations. People are saying they've had enough. They don't want more of our prime farmland sold off. They don't want to see our lawmaking sold off and extra pokie machines brought in so that problem gamblers can fund Auckland's convention centre. And they're saying they don't want our most important strategic assets, that is our energy companies, flogged off into private ownership and probably foreign control over time. So if you care about those issues, if you care about New Zealand owning its own economy and owning its own future, then get along to the march and make your voice heard.
Amen. Matthew, your final word this week is?
What a bore
You'll be
that
there?
will
You'll be there at the march?
I think one of the things to look for is the reconciliation between the National Party and Winston Peters.
No.
And I think what National understands, I don't think anyone in the National Party really believes they're at 50% in the polls, that they've actually increased support since the election. In the National Party, I think they know they only won the election by 5,000 votes, and if Jerry Brownlee hadn't done such a good job actually in Christchurch, they would have lost the election. It was in Christchurch that National won, ironically. So they know that the act is hopeless, and I think they realise their only hope is Winston Peters. They figure that he won't want to be the third wheel on a Labour-Green government, and he's the smaller party, smaller than the Greens. What National can offer Winston Peters is the number 2 party in the government. I think they'd given the foreign ministry back, and of course a knighthood, which is something Labour would never offer, and you watch that's going to happen.
Shocking. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Phil. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. The worst bit about Anzac Day is putting up with all the Shire Volk bleat that it should replace Waitangi Day as our national holiday. Like that will solve all our disharmony. Denial isn't nationhood. For me, Anzac Day is a day that civil society pauses and remembers those who have sacrificed their lives in the name of our country. It is a commemoration of our wars and a solemn occasion when the current generation promises the next generation that we will never throw their lives away as wastefully as we have in the past. Our history is littered with wars that were ill-defined and devoured some of our best and brightest. We respect the glorious dead by promising not to needlessly fill the graves next to them with more wasted life. For the last decade, Anzac Day has been a farce to the respect of our glorious dead. Our involvement in an immoral war to prop up a corrupt regime in Afghanistan while we actively hand over Afghan civilians to torture units means we have ignored the lessons of the past and are now inflicting the very terror we proclaim we are fighting. How do we know the people the SAS attacked and killed in the revenge attack were the ones responsible for the death of a New Zealand soldier? A court decides guilt. Are we now saying the SAS are a court unto themselves who can decide who is guilty and who is not and kill both accordingly? When you are against war as much as I am, it is because war makes good people do bad things. When you dance with the devil doesn't change, you do. If you want to hold true to the glorious dead, we shouldn't be in such a rush to fill the empty graves next to them. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Don't forget, my new show, The Union Report, plays 8 p.m. Monday nights here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Thanks for watching whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.